The old mansion on Pine Hill Road stood tall against the evening sky. Inside, Mei Lin wiped sweat from her brow as she polished the grand piano in the Zhou family's music room. At 32, her hands were already showing signs of the hard work she'd done all her life. Small calluses marked her fingers, fingers that once danced across piano keys but now scrubbed floors and dusted fancy furniture. Every morning at 6, Mei arrived at the Zhou mansion to begin her day's work. She moved like a shadow through the huge house, trying to stay out of the way of the family who barely noticed her presence. Mr. Zhou was a businessman who traveled often. Mrs. Zhou spent her days planning parties and shopping. Their teenage son, Liang, mostly ignored Mei, except when he needed something cleaned in a hurry. "Don't touch anything in the display cabinets," Mrs. Zhou had warned her on the first day. "Those are real crystal pieces from Europe. One mistake and it would cost you a year's salary." Mei never forgot those words. She was careful with everything in the house, but she took special care with the piano. Sometimes, when the family was out, she would stand near it, not quite daring to touch the keys, but close enough to feel its pull. Today, as she polished the black surface of the grand piano, memories flooded back. She remembered sitting at a much smaller piano in her childhood home, her mother beaming with pride as little Mei played her first complete song. Back then, her teacher had called her a natural talent, someone special. "You could study at the conservatory someday," the teacher had told her parents. "She has the gift." But life had other plans. When Mei was 15, her father fell sick. Medical bills piled up. The piano lessons stopped first. Then they sold the piano. By 18, Mei had dropped out of school to work full-time. At 22, she left her home country to find better-paying work abroad. The dreams of becoming a pianist faded away, replaced by the practical need to send money home to her family. Mei finished polishing the piano and stepped back to admire it shine. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Zhou's car pulling into the driveway. Quickly, Mei gathered her cleaning supplies and hurried to the kitchen. "Mei, come here," Mrs. Zhou called as she entered the house, dropping shopping bags in the hallway. Mei wiped her hands on her apron and hurried to the front hall. "Yes, ma'am. We're having a special dinner party tomorrow night. Important people from the city's music society will be here. I need everything perfect." Mrs. Zhou handed Mei a list. "These are additional duties for tomorrow. The house must shine." Mei glanced at the long list and nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I will come early." "See that you do. And wear the uniform I gave you, not those shabby clothes." After Mrs. Zhou walked away, Mei studied the list more carefully. Food preparation, extra cleaning, serving drinks. It would be a long day tomorrow. At the bottom of the list, she noticed, "Prepare music room for performances." That night, in her tiny apartment across town, Mei sat at her small table eating a simple dinner. The walls were thin, and she could hear her neighbor's TV through them. On her table sat a worn photograph, Mei at 13, sitting at a piano, her face bright with joy after winning a local competition. She picked up the photo, running her finger along the edge of the frame. How long had it been since she actually played? 8 years? 10? She couldn't remember. Sometimes, when no one was watching, she would move her fingers in the air, playing imaginary pieces, keeping the memory of music alive in her mind. Mei placed her dishes in the sink and sat on her bed. She stretched out her hands and began to move her fingers, playing silent notes on an invisible keyboard. Chopin's Nocturne, her favorite piece from childhood. Her hands remembered every note, every delicate movement. In her mind, she could hear the music clearly. Tomorrow would be a hard day of work, serving people who would look through her as if she weren't there. But tonight, in the privacy of her small room, she was still a pianist, if only in her dreams. Mei arrived at the Zhou mansion 3 hours earlier than usual. The sky was still dark, and her breath made little clouds in the cold morning air as she hurried up the driveway. Today was the big dinner party, and Mrs. Zhou's list of tasks seemed impossible to finish in time. By noon, Mei's back ached from scrubbing floors and polishing silverware. She had dusted every surface twice and arranged fresh flowers in crystal vases throughout the house. The music room looked perfect. The grand piano gleamed under the chandelier, and chairs were arranged in neat rows for the guests who would listen to tonight's performances. "Mei, where are you?" Mrs. Jew's sharp voice echoed through the hallway. May hurried from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Joe looked May up and down with disapproval. Go change into your uniform now. Guests will arrive in an hour. She handed May a stack of small papers. These are the programs for tonight's performances. Place one on each chair in the music room. As May changed into the stiff black and white uniform, she glanced at one of the programs. 3 pianists were scheduled to play tonight, all famous names that May recognized from music magazines. Her heart beat a little faster at the thought of hearing them play live. By 7 o'clock, the house buzzed with activity. Guests in expensive clothes filled the rooms, their jewelry sparkling under the lights. May moved through the crowd with a tray of champagne glasses, keeping her eyes down as she'd been taught. Careful, girl. A woman in a red dress frowned as May squeezed past. This dress cost more than you make in a year. May nodded and mumbled an apology. Near the grand staircase, she spotted Mrs. Joe surrounded by important-looking people. Mrs. Joe was showing off a small golden statue, an award for supporting the arts. We've hosted the most talented musicians in our home, Mrs. Joe was saying proudly. Tonight's performers are simply the best in the country. May continued serving drinks, her feet already sore from hours of standing. In the kitchen, the chef was arranging tiny, fancy appetizers on silver trays. Take these out right away, he told May, handing her the heaviest tray. And don't drop anything. The tray was awkward to hold, filled with delicate appetizers balanced carefully on top of each other. May made her way slowly back to the crowded living room. She had almost reached a group of guests when someone backed into her, bumping her elbow. Time seemed to slow down as the tray tilted. May tried to steady it, but it was too late. The appetizers slid across the tray and several fell to the floor, landing on the expensive carpet, and worse, on the shoes of an elderly man with thick white eyebrows. A hush fell over the nearby guests. The man looked down at his soiled shoes, then up at May. His face turned red with anger. I'm so sorry, sir, May said quickly, kneeling to clean up the mess. Her hands trembled as she picked up the fallen food. What is going on here? Mrs. Jove's voice cut through the awkward silence. She pushed through the guests and gasped when she saw the scene. May, what have you done? It was an accident, ma'am. Someone bumped into me. Mrs. Jove's face tightened with fury. Always excuses. Do you know who this is? This is Professor Wang, the head of the National Symphony. The elderly man wiped his shoes with a napkin, looking annoyed. It's quite all right, Mrs. Joe. Accidents happen. But Mrs. Joe wasn't finished. She turned to the watching guests with a tight smile. You see what I have to deal with? Simple people, no culture, no understanding of proper behavior. May's cheeks burned with shame as she finished cleaning the carpet. The guests had begun to whisper among themselves, some glancing at her with pity, others with amusement. Later, as the party moved to the music room for the performances, May received a message from the chef. One of the pianists had called to cancel. His car had broken down and he couldn't make it in time. When May delivered this news to Mrs. Joe, the woman's face fell. What? But he was our opening performer. She looked around frantically. The whole evening will be ruined. That's when Mrs. Joe's eyes landed on May, still standing nervously nearby. A strange smile spread across her face. Well, Mrs. Joe said loudly enough for the nearby guests to hear. Since we're short one performer, perhaps my housekeeper would like to entertain us instead. She laughed, and several guests joined in. What do you say, May? Want to show our distinguished guests your talents? May froze. They were all looking at her now, dozens of important people, all expecting to laugh at her expense. Mrs. Joe's eyes gleamed with cruel amusement as she pointed toward the grand piano. Go on, she said. Show us what you can do. The music room fell silent. May stood frozen as all eyes turned to her. Mrs. Joe's smile was sharp as a knife as she took May's arm and guided her toward the grand piano. Our housekeeper will now provide us with some entertainment, Mrs. Joe announced. A few guests chuckled. Others looked embarrassed by the situation. Weren't you, May? May's legs felt heavy as she walked to the piano. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The beautiful instrument that she had polished so carefully that morning now looked terrifying. Behind her, she could hear whispers and the clinking of glasses. Poor thing. How cruel. This should be interesting. She sat down on the bench, her uniform feeling too tight around her neck. The black and white keys stretched before her like an impossible mountain to climb. Mai placed her trembling hands in her lap and stared at the keys, unable to move. Mrs. Zhou cleared her throat loudly. Well, we're waiting. Mai closed her eyes for a moment. In her mind, she saw her childhood home, her mother's encouraging smile, her first piano teacher nodding with approval. She remembered the feeling of the keys under her fingers, the joy of creating music that flowed from her heart. Taking a deep breath, Mai placed her fingers on the keys. She would play something simple, she decided. Just get through it with as little embarrassment as possible. She began with a folk song from her homeland, a simple melody she had learned as a child. The first notes were hesitant, her fingers stiff from years without practice. But as the familiar tune emerged, something awakened inside her. Her hands remembered what her mind had never forgotten. The simple folk song came to an end, and in the brief silence that followed, Mai made a decision. Without pausing, she transitioned into Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It had always been her favorite piece, the one she practiced in her mind during long nights after work. Her fingers moved more confidently now, finding the keys without hesitation. The beautiful melody filled the room, rising and falling like waves on a gentle sea. At first, guests continued their quiet conversations, expecting the performance to be brief and unremarkable. But one by one, they fell silent. Mrs. Zhu's smug smile faded as she watched Mai's fingers dance across the keys with unexpected skill. Mai no longer noticed the audience. She was lost in the music, eyes half closed as she swayed slightly on the bench. Years of pent-up emotion poured through her fingers, the sadness of abandoned dreams, the loneliness of her life, the beauty she still found in the world despite everything. Her technique wasn't perfect. Years without practice had left rough edges in her playing. But there was something in her performance that went beyond technique, a depth of feeling that reached into the hearts of everyone listening. Professor Wang, the elderly man whose shoes had been soiled earlier, leaned forward in his chair, his thick eyebrows raised in surprise. Next to him, a young woman with glasses wiped a tear from her eye. The piece reached its tender conclusion, the final notes hanging in the air like stars. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Mai sat still, her hands resting on the keys, afraid to break the spell by looking up. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to clap. Others joined in, the applause growing louder. Mai finally raised her head to see the entire room on their feet, faces showing astonishment and appreciation. Mrs. Zhu stood frozen, her face a mixture of shock and embarrassment. Her husband, who had been quiet all evening, was applauding with genuine enthusiasm. "Bravo!" called Professor Wang. "Bravo!" A tall man with silver-streaked hair made his way to the piano. Mai recognized him as Professor Chen, the famous music director whose picture she had seen in newspapers. "My dear," he said quietly, so only she could hear, "where did you learn to play like that?" Mai's hands were still trembling, but now from adrenaline rather than fear. I studied as a child," she managed to say. "A long time ago." Professor Chen shook his head in wonder. No, that kind of interpretation doesn't come from childhood lessons alone. You have a gift." He looked at her uniform, then back at her face. "Who are you, really?" Before Mai could answer, guests surrounded the piano, peppering her with questions and compliments. Someone asked her to play another piece. The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed, the mocking laughter replaced by genuine admiration. Through the crowd, Mai caught Mrs. Zhu's eye. The woman who had intended to humiliate her now stood apart, watching as her housekeeper became the star of her own party. For the first time in years, Mai felt something long forgotten stirring in her heart. Hope. The next morning, Mai arrived at the Zhou mansion at her usual time. She hadn't slept much, replaying the events of the previous night in her mind. The feeling of the piano keys under her fingers, the stunned faces of the guests, the applause that had seemed to go on forever, it all felt like a dream. She quietly let herself in through the back door, expecting to start her usual cleaning routine. But as she hung up her coat, Mrs. Zhou appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, still in her silk robe. "Me," she said, her voice unusually soft. "Come have some tea." Confused, Maid followed her employer to the dining room. Mrs. Zhou poured tea into delicate cups with her own hands, something Mai had never seen her do before. Last night, Mrs. Zhou began, stirring her tea slowly, was quite unexpected. Mai looked down at her teacup. "I'm sorry if I embarrassed you, ma'am." Mrs. Zhou waved her hand dismissively. "Don't be silly. The guests haven't stopped calling me this morning. Everyone wants to know about you." She leaned forward with newfound interest. "Why didn't you tell us you could play like that?" "You never asked," May said simply. Mrs. Zhou had the decency to look slightly ashamed. "Well, Professor Chen was particularly impressed. He left his card and asked that you call him." She slid a business card across the table. May carefully picked up the card. Professor Chen, director of the City Conservatory of Music. Her heart skipped a beat. The doorbell rang, interrupting the awkward conversation. A moment later, Mr. Zhao entered with a short, balding man carrying a camera. "Ah, perfect timing," Mr. Zhao said. "May, this is Mr. Liu from the City Times. He'd like to do a story about you." "About me?" May's eyes widened. "Yes, about our talented housekeeper," Mrs. Zhou said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're so proud to have discovered such a gifted pianist working right under our roof." Mr. Liu began asking questions, scribbling notes while Mr. Zhou nodded enthusiastically. The reporter wanted to know where Mai had studied, how long she had worked for the Zheus, and how they had discovered her talent. "It was my wife's idea," Mr. Zhou said smoothly. "She has an eye for talent. She insisted that Mai perform last night." Mi glanced at Mrs. Zhou, who was now smiling as if the cruel joke had been her brilliant plan all along. The Zhaos were rewriting history right in front of her eyes, turning their attempt to humiliate her into a story of their own generosity and insight. After the reporter left, promising the story would appear in Sunday's paper, Mr. Zhou turned to Mai with a businesslike expression. "Professor Chen called this morning. He'd like you to visit the conservatory today. Mrs. Zhou and I think you should go." He checked his watch. "Take the rest of the day off. The cleaning can wait." 2 hours later, Mai stood in the grand entrance hall of the City Conservatory of Music. Students carrying instrument cases rushed past her. Through open doors, she could hear the sounds of practice rooms, scales, arpeggios, fragments of sonatas and concertos. "Ah, there you are." Professor Chen's voice boomed across the hall. He hurried toward her, hand extended. "I'm so glad you came." He led her through corridors lined with portraits of famous musicians, talking excitedly about her performance the night before. "Your technique needs polishing, of course. That's to be expected after years without practice. But your musicality, your interpretation." He shook his head in wonder. "That can't be taught." They reached a large classroom with a grand piano in the center. To May's surprise, several people were waiting inside, including Professor Wang and the young woman with glasses who had been at the party. "This is Dr. Lin, our head of piano studies," Professor Chen said, introducing the young woman. "And you already know Professor Wang." Professor Wang smiled at her, the incident with his shoes apparently forgotten. "I've been telling my colleagues about your remarkable performance." May felt overwhelmed. "I don't understand why I'm here." Professor Chen gestured for her to sit down. "After you left last night, I did some research. Your name sounded familiar to me." He opened a folder on the table. "May Lin, you won the National Youth Piano Competition when you were 13, didn't you?" Mi's breath caught in her throat. "Yes. How did you know?" "I was one of the judges," Professor Wang said quietly. "I never forget a truly gifted player. We found these," Dr. Lin added, spreading old newspaper clippings on the table. Yellowed with age, they showed a younger May at various competitions, smiling proudly with trophies and certificates. May touched the faded photographs with trembling fingers. That was another life. "What happened?" Professor Chen asked gently. May told them her story, her father's illness, the family's financial struggles, the hard decision to give up music and focus on supporting her family. She explained how she had come to this country hoping for better opportunities, how she had ended up working as a housekeeper for families who barely noticed her existence. "For years, I've only played in my mind," she finished. "Sometimes on tabletops or counters when no one was watching. Last night was the first time I touched a real piano in almost a decade." The three professors exchanged glances. May, Professor Chen said finally, we would like to offer you something. The conservatory has a special program for exceptional adult students. We'd like you to enroll. Dr. Lin nodded enthusiastically. You'll need intensive training to make up for lost time, but based on what we heard last night, it would be a crime not to develop your talent. I can't afford tuition, May said, feeling her hopes rise and fall in the same moment. There would be no tuition, Professor Wang said firmly. We're offering you a full scholarship, and more than that, a position as a teaching assistant to help with your living expenses. May sat in stunned silence, unable to believe what she was hearing. Your journey is not over, Mei Lin, Professor Chen said softly. In fact, I think it's just beginning. The Sunday newspaper lay open on Mei's small kitchen table. Her own face looked back at her from the arts section, a photo taken at the Zhe's party. The headline read, Hidden Talent, Housekeeper Stuns Elite Music Circle. She read the article for the 5th time, still unable to believe it was about her. A knock at her door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, she found Professor Chen standing there with a thick folder under his arm. I hope I'm not disturbing you, he said, looking around her tiny apartment with interest rather than judgment. I wanted to bring you some materials before your first day tomorrow. Mei invited him in, quickly clearing books from her only chair. Would you like some tea? While she prepared tea, Professor Chen opened the folder on her table. I've been doing some research into your background, he said. With your permission, I reached out to your former piano teacher back in your home country. Mei nearly dropped the teacup. Mr. Zhang? You found him? Professor Chen nodded, pulling out some papers. He remembered you immediately. He sent these. He handed her several yellowed sheets of music with handwritten notes in the margins. Mei recognized her teacher's neat handwriting, his careful instructions about fingering and dynamics. The sight of it brought tears to her eyes. Mr. Zhang kept everything, Professor Chen explained. Your competition programs, news clippings, even recordings of your performances. He pulled out a small USB drive. This contains digitized versions of your recitals from ages 10 to 15. We listened to them at the conservatory yesterday. He looked at her with newfound respect. You were remarkable even then. Your interpretation of Bach was unusual for someone so young, very mature. Mei's hands trembled as she held the music sheets. I haven't seen these in so long. Your teacher wrote me a long letter about you. Professor Chen's voice softened. He said you were his most promising student ever. When you disappeared from the music scene, he tried to find you. After my father got sick, we moved to a smaller apartment. I lost touch with everyone from that part of my life, Mei explained, pouring the tea. It was too painful to stay connected when I knew I couldn't continue my studies. Professor Chen sipped his tea thoughtfully. Mr. Zhang also sent this. He handed her a newspaper article she had never seen before. It was dated 3 years after she had stopped playing. The headline announced the winners of the national piano competition, the very competition she had been preparing for when her father fell ill. The girl who won that year, Professor Chen said quietly, was good, but not as good as you would have been. Mr. Zhang was certain you would have taken first prize. Mei stared at the image of the smiling winner. That could have been her in another life. She felt no jealousy, only a strange sense of seeing a road not taken. Your story has touched many people, Professor Chen continued. Since the newspaper article came out this morning, we've received calls from several patrons of the arts who want to support your return to music. He pulled out more papers, schedules, course descriptions, a map of the conservatory campus. Tomorrow, we'll assess exactly where you are technically and create a personalized program. Dr. Lin has volunteered to work with you privately 3 times a week. Mei felt overwhelmed. This is all happening so fast. Time is precious, Professor Chen said simply. You've lost enough of it already. As he was leaving, he paused at the door. Oh, I almost forgot. The chefs called me this morning. Mei tensed. Were they angry? Would they fire her for accepting the conservatory's offer? They want to support your studies as well, Professor Chen said with slight amusement. Mrs. Xiao has offered to reduce your working hours so you can attend classes. She seemed very eager to be associated with your discovery. After he left, Mai sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by the pieces of her past and the possibilities of her future. She reached for her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "Hello, Mama," she said when the call connected. "Yes, it's me. I have news." She told her mother everything: the party, the piano, the professors, the scholarship. As she spoke, she could hear her mother beginning to cry softly. "Your father would be so proud," her mother said. "He always felt guilty that his illness ended your dreams." "My dreams didn't end, Mama," May replied. They were just waiting. That night, May couldn't sleep. She sat at her small table, reviewing the conservatory materials. The technical requirements looked daunting. Her fingers had years of domestic work to overcome. But her mind had never stopped playing, never stopped learning. She spread her hands on the tabletop and began to move her fingers in familiar patterns. Tomorrow, she would play on a real piano again. Tomorrow, she would begin the journey back to the life she had once loved. Outside her window, the city slept under a canopy of stars. Somewhere in that same city, a grand piano waited for her. And this time, no one would be laughing when she sat down to play. The practice room was small but perfect. Sunlight streamed through a tall window, lighting up the dust particles that danced in the air. In the center stood a well-used upright piano, not as grand as the Joe family's, but with a warm, rich tone that May had come to love over the past 3 weeks. She flexed her fingers before placing them on the keys. The skin was red and slightly swollen from hours of practice. Her muscles ached in a way they hadn't since she was a teenager, determined to master difficult pieces. "Again," she whispered to herself, "from the beginning." She started the Bach prelude once more, focusing on the trouble spot in the middle section where her fingers kept tangling. After playing for so long only in her mind, her hands needed to relearn what they once knew so well. A knock on the door interrupted her practice. Dr. Lin entered with a cup of tea. "I thought you might need this," she said, placing the steaming cup on top of the piano. "You've been in here since 7 this morning." Mee glanced at the clock, surprised to see it was already past noon. "I didn't notice the time." Dr. Lin sat on a chair in the corner. "How are your hands holding up?" May stretched her fingers. "They're getting stronger." "And your job at the Jazz?" "Better than I expected," May admitted. "Mrs. Zhou now introduces me as our pianist to her friends. I only clean 3 days a week now." Dr. Lin laughed. Amazing how quickly she changed her tune. She took a folder from her bag. "I have news. The spring showcase is in 3 months, and Professor Chen wants you to perform." May nearly spilled her tea. "Me? But I'm nowhere near ready. The other students have been practicing for years without interruption." "That's true," Dr. Lin agreed. "But none of them have your story or your natural musicality." She opened the folder to reveal sheet music for Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. "Professor Chen thinks this would be perfect for you." May stared at the complex score with its dense clusters of notes. "This is one of the most difficult concertos in the repertoire." "Yes, and it's also about second chances," Dr. Lin said softly. "Rachmaninoff wrote it after recovering from a deep depression. It was his comeback piece." She smiled at May. "Just like it could be yours." That evening, May returned to her apartment, her mind spinning with thoughts of the showcase. On her small table sat a letter she'd received that morning but hadn't had time to open. It was from her younger sister, Ling. She opened it now, smiling at her sister's familiar handwriting. Ling wrote about her university studies and how proud everyone back home was of May. The local newspaper had picked up the story about her performance at the Zhou's party. Her old neighbors and friends were talking about it. "Mr. Zheng cried when he heard the news," Ling wrote. "He always said your music would find its way back to you." May folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others she had received since her story became public. Her brother had written that he'd found recordings of her childhood performances and played them for his children. "Your niece wants to learn piano now," he'd written. "She says she wants to be just like her Aunt May." The thought of her 5-year-old niece sitting at a piano made May smile. Perhaps some good would come from all this beyond her own second chance. Her phone rang. It was Mrs. Zhou. "May, dear." Mrs. Zhou's voice was sweeter than it had ever been during May's years of employment. "I'm calling about the charity gala next month. Several of my friends have requested that you perform." May hesitated. She had moved from being the invisible housekeeper to being the Zhao's prized discovery. It was strange how quickly things had changed. "I'm not sure I'll be ready for a public performance so soon," May said honestly. "Oh, but you must," Mrs. Xu insisted. "Everyone is talking about you. About us, really, how we discovered you. It would mean so much." The day of the spring showcase arrived with bright sunshine and a cool breeze. Backstage at the conservatory's grand hall, students in formal attire tuned instruments and practiced last-minute passages. The air buzzed with nervous energy and excitement. In a small practice room off the main corridor, May sat alone at a piano, not playing but simply resting her hands on the silent keys. She wore a borrowed concert dress, midnight blue with tiny silver beads that caught the light when she moved. Her hair, usually pulled back in a practical bun for cleaning, had been styled by Dr. Lin's sister, who owned a beauty salon. 3 months of intensive practice had transformed her hands. The calluses from years of scrubbing floors had been replaced by the muscular strength of a pianist. Her posture had changed too. She held herself differently now, with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her way back to herself. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Professor Chen peeked in. 5 minutes, he said with an encouraging smile. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," May admitted. "My heart is racing." Professor Chen entered and sat beside her on the bench. "That's normal. Even professional pianists get nervous before performances. What if I make a mistake? What if I freeze?" "Then you'll take a breath and continue," he said simply. "Remember, this audience is already on your side. Your story has touched many people." May nodded, trying to calm her breathing. Is my family here?" "Front row, center," Professor Chen confirmed. "Your mother arrived this morning. Dr. Lin picked her up from the airport." Tears filled Mi's eyes. "Mama is here." "But the ticket cost." "The conservatory has many supporters," Professor Chen said with a wink. "One of them was happy to sponsor your mother's journey. She's so proud of you, May." A stagehand appeared at the door. 2 minutes, Miss Lin." As Professor Chen left, May closed her eyes and thought about the journey that had brought her here. From cleaning houses to preparing for a concerto performance in just a few months, it seemed impossible. Yet here she was. She thought of her father, who had encouraged her love of music from the time she was small. "He's watching too," she whispered to herself. From somewhere. The stagehand returned. "It's time." May walked through the corridor toward the stage, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. As she passed, other students whispered good luck and gave encouraging smiles. At the edge of the stage, she paused, taking in the sight of the packed concert hall. The audience fell silent as she walked to the grand piano that dominated center stage. In the front row, she spotted her mother, looking older than when May had last seen her but beaming with pride. Beside her sat Mi's brother and sister, who had also somehow made the journey. And next to them, unexpectedly, sat Mr. Zhang, her childhood piano teacher, now elderly but still sitting straight-backed and attentive as he had in all her lessons. The Zhou family was there too, dressed in their finest clothes, Mrs. Zhou nodding and smiling at acquaintances as if to say, "Yes, she worked for us. We discovered her." Mi took her seat at the piano as Professor Chen stepped onto the podium to conduct the student orchestra behind her. He gave her a reassuring nod and raised his baton. The orchestra began the haunting introduction to Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto. The dark, brooding chords set the mood of struggle and impending triumph. Mai listened, counting the measures until her entrance. The moment arrived. She took a deep breath and brought her hands down on the keys, playing the famous opening chords that built in intensity like waves crashing on a shore. The sound filled the hall, washing over the audience. At first, May was acutely aware of every note, every finger movement, but gradually she lost herself in the music. The hours of practice, the years of playing in her mind, all came together in this moment. Her fingers flew across the keys, finding the notes with confidence born of dedication. The first movement ended with thunderous applause. May barely heard it, already focusing on the lyrical second movement with its tender melody that always reminded her of a love song to life itself. As she played, memories flashed through her mind, Her father showing her a piano for the first time, her mother saving to pay for lessons, the small victories of childhood competitions, the heartbreak of giving it all up, the years of silent longing while she cleaned other people's homes, and finally, the cruel joke at the Joe's party that had turned into her salvation. The final movement arrived, fast, demanding, triumphant. May's fingers danced across the keys with newfound freedom. This was the music of someone who had overcome, who had returned from the darkness into light. She played with everything she had, holding nothing back. The concerto raced toward its conclusion. Orchestra and piano together built toward the final resounding chords. May's hands came down for the last time, the sound lingering in the air for a breathless moment before the hall erupted in applause. The audience rose to their feet. May sat stunned, hardly believing the standing ovation was for her. Professor Chen extended his hand to help her up, whispering, "Take your bow. You've earned it." She stood and faced the audience, bowing as tears streamed down her face. Her mother was crying too, clutching the hands of May's siblings. Mr. Zhang was nodding with the satisfaction of a teacher who had always known his students' potential. Backstage, after countless hugs and congratulations, May found a moment alone with her mother. "I'm so sorry it took so long," May said, holding her mother's hands. "All those years cleaning houses instead of playing." Her mother shook her head firmly. "No apologies. You did what you had to do for our family. But music never left you. It was just waiting for the right moment to return." Later, as the crowd thinned, Professor Chen approached May with an envelope. "This came for you yesterday. I thought you might want to open it after your performance." Inside was an invitation to audition for the International Piano Competition in Vienna, one of the most prestigious in the world. "They never invite unknown pianists to audition," Professor Chen explained. "Someone on their committee was in the audience at the Joe's party that night. They've been following your progress." May stared at the invitation in disbelief. "Do you think I could?" "I know you can," he said confidently. "This is just the beginning, May." As she left the concert hall that night, surrounded by her family, May paused to look up at the stars. The same stars had looked down on her when she was a housekeeper, exhausted after a day of cleaning. The same stars had witnessed her silent practicing on tabletops and counter edges. The same stars now saw her emerge as the pianist she was always meant to be. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be more challenges, more hard work, more moments of doubt. But May Lin was no longer afraid. She had found her way back to music, and music had found its way back to her. And that, she knew, was the most beautiful composition of all.